here from Nobu House in Meklodganj, Dharamsala, as well as online from all over the world, from different time zones and different places. Thank you to each and every one of you. We have come to the closing of this very unique conference. And before I invite our keynote guest to come up and deliver their address, I just wanted to give a few opening remarks. At least a quarter of the world's land area is owned, managed, used, or occupied by indigenous peoples and local communities. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the physical, emotional, and mental labor of frontline communities from the most affected areas all over the globe who continue to literally put their physical bodies on the line to safeguard and protect remaining reserves of carbon sequestration all over the world. From the First Nation communities on Turtle Island and elsewhere, to Tibetan people on the Tibetan Plateau, communities across the African continent, and our own Adivasi communities here in the Indian subcontinent. We began this conference from the exiled capital of the Tibetan people, inspired by the words and living example of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama of Tibet, to bring together a diverse group of climate justice activists and advocates from academics, community organizers, entrepreneurs, business executives, technologists, and innovators. We had the precious privilege of receiving an audience with His Holiness, who reminded us that working to save our planet is a true act of compassion, to protect, preserve, and regenerate the rich, complex, and profoundly beautiful workings of our planet. I would like to now invite American science fiction writer and a climate visionary in his own right, Kim Stanley Robinson, to please come up and deliver his closing keynote.
Krishna and the International Campaign for Tibet and the Tibet Policy Institute. It is a huge pleasure to be here. An honor, I must say. And I am going to give a talk that is an attempt to take a flyover of some of the many ideas that have been discussed over the last couple of days by the panels here. An amazing array of expertise and experienced people from all over the world to telling us of good things that were happening. And of course, they were only a tiny percentage, a representative sample of what's going on all over in the world. So if that's the representative sample and they are 1,000th or 1,000,000th of the effort being made, then maybe we can indeed scrape through. And so my talk is called Creating a Good Anthropocene. And this is, I'm surprised at that title, as it came up at late. The Anthropocene is generally regarded as a sign of catastrophe or apocalypse or disaster, that we were in the Holocene and then we did so many bad things to the planet, or we have so much power to intervene in its systems, and in particular polluting its atmosphere, but also wrecking biospheres left, right, and center with the number of people that there are, that the Anthropocene is a mark of something disastrous going on. But it doesn't have to be that way. There is the possibility of us creating a civilization that has a balance, that we live in balance with the biosphere that is our extended body. It's not going to be easy. We're starting from a somewhat bad position, but it is possible, and I want to describe such. So this is an exercise in utopian science fiction, and I'm not going to do it in narrative style. That is called The Ministry for the Future, the novel that got me invited here, and that's 560 pages long, and the people reading it take 21 hours to read it aloud. I can't talk that fast. So I'm going to do this as a kind of a recipe out of a cookbook. I'm going to list the ingredients that would make for a good Anthropocene. And those of you who have been listening to the panel discussions will be able to flesh out things that I'm going to bounce over quite quickly, but with a couple pauses along the way to talk about things that haven't maybe been discussed enough in these panel discussions that would be a good addition to it. So, and it's a nature of language and time that I have to take these one at a time, but actually, as has been noted often in the last couple of days, all these are necessary components. I'm not even prioritizing them, although maybe a little bit, but they're all essential ingredients. But I want to start with one that maybe isn't the most intuitive one, given that this is a conference on climate change, an absolutely essential ingredient, which is justice. Justice among humans. Justice, equality, equity. And by equity, what we mean is equality between peoples adjusted by the history of the last 2 or 3 centuries. So that instead of saying that everybody alive on the planet right now is instantaneously equal starting right now, no, there are people in nations that were colonizers and imperial nations that have had a historical head start in infrastructure and wealth. And there are people from post-colonial nations who are still recovering from the damages of the last couple centuries. And what equity means to say is that there's going to be some balancing going forward to create to make up a little bit for the injustices of the past and give an extra help to those who have been disadvantaged by the history of colonialism over the last couple of years. And it's interesting to note, and I think really encouraging to note, that equity is written into the Paris Agreement a couple of times. It's fundamental to the Paris Agreement, and that was a great accomplishment in 2015. So, what I mean as a utopian science fiction writer by justice is everybody is living at adequacy. There is nobody immiserated on the planet. This is a floor to our social reality that we cannot live without, a necessary floor of adequacy. And this is the standard utopian line. Everybody should have food, water, shelter, clothing, healthcare, education, electricity, and security, by which I mean that when you've got these things, you know, you trust that you're going to keep them for the rest of your life, and your children are going to have them too. So yes, physical security, but also social security, long-term security, a feeling that you have your adequacy and it's not going away. So that's the floor. And there are at least 2 billion people on this planet, and maybe more, who are not to that floor of adequacy. So we are starting at a very much an unjust and a system that no one can be proud of, a world civilization that at this point is not yet a fully human accomplishment. We can do that floor, by the way, technically and physically. The amount of resources on the planet, the power of the technologies that we've made up. This is not an idle dream. 8 billion people can live at adequacy in the way that I described it. So that it's worth keeping that in mind as the first task. And the Sustainable Development Goals were an acknowledgement of that about 20 years ago, UN, and a lot was done with the SDGs. But it's interesting to note that that was all done on the side by charity. And the UN had to beg for money. It was not civilization's main project, and yet a lot got done. And what that suggests is that if that was civilization's main project, we could do it. Because if you do it on the side from what nations happen to give to the UN, then that's suggestive of the power that we have to erase poverty and get everybody to adequacy. Then gender equality for the whole planet. The Scandinavian nations are the ones with the best rating for gender equality. Iceland best of all, but that's like 300,000 people on this planet. And the rest of the societies have variable degrees of gender equality, and the women on the planet are the force keeping us all alive in terms of social reproduction. This is a name for the work that people do that doesn't get paid for in capitalism. It's a good name, social reproduction. It reproduces the social. You're taking care of your kids. You're taking care of your grandparents and the aged and the ill. This is almost entirely women's work. So gender equality. And then lastly, just as there's a floor, there should be a ceiling. In other words, why the billionaires? What's going on with that? Let me remind you that after World War II, the American Congress, which was Republican, under a Republican President Eisenhower, established progressive taxes such that after you made $400,000, 95% of it went to the government in a progressive taxation curve that was so sharp that you couldn't make much more than that. In modern dollars, that would be like $4 million, and that was your asymptotic cap. You couldn't make more than that. After World War II, rich people were in disgrace because they were regarded by society as being part of the cause of the war and also profiteers during the war, and nobody liked them. They were not fetishized. They were not made into celebrity heroes like they were now. They were not treated as special people. They just were in the right spot at the right time with the right capital. And antitrust laws and progressive taxation meant that there was a ceiling as well as a floor. It was the Reagan-Thatcher counter-revolution of 1980 that began to blow that up, and one aspect of neoliberal capitalism that we've lived under for the last 40 years is that you can get as rich as you want, and then everybody will love you because you're some kind of a star. But it's just that the antitrust laws haven't been applied. There's no particular geniuses out there. It's not that they're special, it's that the system allows for an accumulation of wealth in a pyramid scheme to the top. We can cut that off by taxes. And if you're thinking to yourself, oh, the rich are so powerful, we could never do that, they'd move somewhere else, they'd buy our government, blah, blah. This is called capitalist realism. This is being caught in an imaginary state that the system that we're in is somehow fixed, it's somehow natural. None of that's true. It's a very brittle, fragile system. It's falling apart. As it falls apart, we could establish a ceiling as well as a floor. This is sometimes called wage ratio or wage parity. In the U.S. Navy, the able seaman that joins the Navy gets adequacy of 1, and it's $25,000 a year, room and board and education. The admiral in the Navy at the topping out at $200,000 a year, that's a 1-to-8 ratio. In Mondragon, Spain, it's a 1-to-9 ratio. I always revert to the 1-to-10 ratio because it's so easy to remember and calculate. In other words, the adequacy is 1, and I mean adequacy. And then as rich as you can get, the ceiling is 10 times 1 is 10. Well, if you've got one adequacy, and then you've got another one, and then you've got another one, and another, and another, and another, by the time you have 10 adequacies, you are ridiculously, luxuriously rich. But in this world, the rich people sometimes have 1,500 times as much as the one in compensation for CEOs. The median is 350, 1 to 350. This might be just American, it might be the world. And what that means is that the executive comes into the office and works one day and makes as much money as his beginning workers make in 1 year. Now, that person did not do 365 times as much work. It's just the feudal system reestablished on us. It doesn't do the rich any good. They all suffer badly from anxiety and mental illness and all kinds of problems of the Midas complex. They're so rich that they don't know if they're human anymore. It doesn't do them any good. It doesn't do the rest of us any good. So this is something that needs to change. And it's something to think about, too. In the battle for control of world history, if you're saying to the rich, we are going to do a fiscal decapitation here, what Keynes called the euthanasia of the rentier class, rather ominous kind of 1930s type phrase, but it was one that Keynes used. He merely meant dispossession of excessive wealth. And it's a good idea. Let's keep it in mind. Let me finish by saying how. Progressive taxes, very powerful instrument. Also treaties. We would have to have this international, and people couldn't escape to some other country. Norms. Just, this isn't done anymore. This is ridiculous. And that means satire, laughter, shame. A new structure of feeling in which being more than 10 times adequacy is just unheard of. A thing from the neoliberal age that finally went away. Okay, the second ingredient, carbon reduction. We've been talking about that a lot. It has to happen. We're at 410 to 420 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We're at 1.1 or 1.2 degrees C over the start of the Industrial Revolution, and we don't want to go over 1.5. This is the emergency, the climate emergency. We're in desperate straits. We're burning fossil fuels at a rate of about, well, it's fluctuating, but say 40 gigatons, 40 billion tons a year into the atmosphere. We can, I've been saying this for so long that I realize it's no longer true. We could burn about 500 more gigatons before we hit the 2C level, and then we really are cooked. So that's, you can do the calculations as to how many years that is. I can't right now. We don't have much time. And here's something to add. We can burn 500 gigatons. We have found in the ground 3,500 gigatons of fossil fuels, identified, ready to pull out and sell and burn. It means we have 3,000 gigatons, 3,000 billion tons of carbon in the ground that we simply have to leave there. Well, if you were to cost it out at the value of a barrel of oil right now, which of course is going up and down, but it's the only way that I could manage to estimate it, it's $1,600 trillion worth of fossil fuels that needs to be stay in the ground. And 75% of that fossil fuels is owned by nation states. The private oil companies are not the problem. Exxon, Shell, they only own about 25%, and you could nationalize them. You could drive them out of business with the proper taxation very quickly. It's that nations rely on those sale of those fossil fuels for their income, where they pay their teachers, their pensions, their militaries, their air control, their road building. They rely on those sales, and they are looking down the barrel of a loaded gun financially. And this does explain big parts of the war of Russia on Ukraine, because Russia is a big petrostate. But so is somewhat more innocent nations. And indeed, you know, everybody was burning fossil fuels. So these are not guilty parties. They just happen to be sitting on it. Norway, Canada, Australia, but also Nigeria, Venezuela, Mexico, Brazil, United States and China, yes, although they don't have the same relationship to the dependence on that money coming in to keep them solvent. But if a government of a nation is looking at bankruptcy, social disruption, failed state, and some kind of a Syria, Somalia failed state status for their country, then they're going to want to burn that fossil fuel more than they're going to want to keep us below 2 degrees C. It is a necessity that we compensate them somehow. At first it sounds like paying blackmail. You're like, well, you know, they're burning us up. Why should we pay them? That's like a blackmailer or a guy with an explosive vest on saying, pay me or I'll blow up the world. But we're the ones that have been addicted to fossil fuels all along, and they themselves just happen to be sitting on it. The compensation is, it's not going to be $1,600 trillion. That kind of amount of money would blow up our trust in money itself. So it's going to have to be amortized. In other words, it'll be a payout over a century or two, like it would be if they had burned it. It will be discounted. They're going to have to take a haircut. It's worthless poison now, so they're going to get paid to keep them alive, but they aren't going to make what they're making now. And it's going to be entailed. So, in other words, we'll give them the money, but they need to spend it on decarbonization. They can't, corrupt officials can't pocket it and run off to Monaco. It's going to have to be entailed. Now, people paying it, the citizens will scream, oh my God, you're paying blackmailers. The people getting paid, especially the officials, will scream, you're imposing on our sovereignty. If you want to give us money, fine, but when it's ours, you can't tell us what to do, that's neo-colonialism, blah, blah, blah. On the other hand, we don't want that money going into the pockets of kleptocrats, and we want it used for decarbonization. Entailment will be part of the agreement. It'll be a contract. It doesn't matter if it's a smart contract, it'll be an intelligent contract. What it'll be saying is, comply with this, you'll get paid, you'll be solvent. You don't comply with this, you're in trouble. Now, I don't know, I'm thinking the Paris Agreement itself, the central banks, because this will be a central bank thing, the International Energy Association, the Fossil Fuels Non-Proliferation Treaty, the World Bank. There are various the UN itself. There are spaces where this particular financial settlement can be...
Recording in progress.
That's true. So this is, there have been a lot of elephants in the room in these last couple of days. I don't know how many people have said that. The elephant in the room is China. This is a very crowded room at this point. It's a herd of elephants in the room. But that is one big elephant, this problem, outstanding problem. As for the rest of the carbon payout, this is much more benign. You draw down a ton of CO2 from the atmosphere, you get paid a carbon coin, you turn in the carbon coin for US dollars on the currency exchange market, and you get more money than you paid out to draw that carbon down. You can make a living drawing carbon down. The carbon coin will have to be backed by the central banks. The central banks have an organization called the Network for Greening the Financial System. I didn't know it existed when I wrote Ministry for the Future, and when I found out, I was really happy, because this shouldn't be an idea that just shows up in a science fiction novel. There are 89 central banks in a study group studying it, saying, how can we green money? And the carbon coin is one of the things they're contemplating. It's a beautiful idea, because then instead of paying a cost, a penalty, for bringing down carbon virtuously, you can actually make your living in it. And there's many ways to bring down carbon. You could do regenerative agriculture anywhere on this earth, a farmer, and get a carbon coin as well as your crop. You'd be growing carbon, you'd be putting carbon in the soil, you'd be growing soil as well as your crop, and get paid more for it. There are many ways in which we're going to draw down carbon from the atmosphere, because we're going to have too much up there by the time we stop emitting carbon. There's going to be more up there than we really can handle over the long haul, and the drawdown is going to be across the board, and it's going to take a few decades, and you need to be able to make a living at it. So this is going to happen, I think. Compensating the petrostates is bizarre, and I don't know if that'll happen or not. It might have to. But compensating people for decarbonizing, that, I think, will be a coming thing and will be part of our salvation financially. Because all these good plans, the question keeps coming up. How would we pay for it? And that's a good question, because let's shift to another thing. Private capital goes to the highest rate of return. And taking crap out of the atmosphere and plugging it into the ground is not the highest rate of return. No one wants that carbon. And if we're taking down 500 gigatons of carbon dioxide, of carbon from the atmosphere, putting it in the ground, that's like more mass than all the cars ever manufactured. Think about that. Every single car ever made in the history of humanity, you got to bury it underground. Well, nobody wants that. Nobody's going to pay for that. And yet it still needs to be done, and so people need to get paid to do it. So this is where the carbon coin comes in. There's also carbon quantitative easing. Quantitative easing in 2008 and in 2020, we made up $5 to $13 trillion. It's actually hard to tell how much, depends on how you calculate. Put it into the system to keep the economy liquid and avoid a depression. And it worked both times, and we didn't immediately lose our faith in money. There are arguments, but the economists cannot get a handle on how much new money can be injected into the system without destroying people's faith in money. That's going to be an ongoing experiment. And what I think is that every year, year after year, the Network for Greening the Financial System is going to have to inject about $3 trillion a year. The Biden administration almost injected $2 trillion for this very purpose. But all the central banks together will make it more politically possible. $3 trillion a year, every year, forever. Now, a couple of days ago, Sarah Yang talked about McKinsey. The McKinsey company had made an estimate of $9.78 trillion per year invested would make the carbon transition for us. And, McKinsey I have my issues with, but on the other hand, they're serious people. But you have to laugh at the 9.78. That 8 is like, as a science fiction writer, they are doing quantitative science fiction. They're making assumptions, they're going out into the future, they're doing scenarios, they're doing the best they can, they're serious people. But why not just say 10 trillion a year? And notice that I only said 3 trillion a year for the central banks. There's a discrepancy there that is going to be more than compensated for by private capital itself, because there's a lot of private capital in this world. Mark Carney at Glasgow said, I've got banks that hold $130 trillion in asset that have promised all to go green. He was scoffed at a little, but it was an important moment. And what used to be hedge fund managers, which were basically jerks on Wall Street that were trying to get the alpha and make more money for rich people than the ordinary stock market would make, that was a whole industry, and everybody flocked to it, and 25% of Harvard graduates went to Wall Street to play that stupid game. Now, they call themselves asset managers, and they're working with pension funds. They're working with people's money to invest it into green projects over the long term, because it's good business to keep the biosphere alive and healthy. In fact, it's bad business if the biosphere crashes. And private capital, whatever you think of it, I myself as a leftist would say, I wish the government was in control of all this stuff, but that's not the world we live in. There is an awful lot of private capital. Remember that $130 trillion? Well, Central Bank of China, the biggest bank, holds $5 trillion in assets. U.S. Federal Reserve holds $4 trillion in assets. They basically want to get money out there. So it just shows you that we are in a capitalist world where private capital is the big dog for money, and it's being run by intelligent and thoughtful people. There aren't that many snidely whiplash psychopaths out there saying, I'm going to burn up the world just for the fun of it. There are a few, but by and large, these are good citizens thinking, what can I do with this amazing position of responsibility I have? And I saw it at Glasgow. They're saying, let's go long, let's keep the planet alive, let's do green investing, we'll make some money back. It might not be the highest rate of return, but that algorithm has collapsed. The idea that all money has to go to the highest rate of return has fallen apart in the climate emergency, hopefully. This is a utopian story here, and we'll see what happens. The activists in the last panel make it quite clear that this is a wicked political fight, and not everybody's convinced to this point of view. But we can see. If that much capital is being devoted to climate change mitigation and adaptation, we will have full employment. And full employment is a game changer. There's more work to be done than there is people on Earth. That whole fantasy that there's not going to be work anymore because of automation, this is a bad science fiction story. It's completely wrong. Most jobs need human beings to do them. And the ones that can be done by robots were robotic jobs where humans were pretending to be robots. Robots do those jobs better in an assembly line. But as a plumber or out in the world or the carpenters here, robots are never going to be building this world. It's human beings. You need to be that flexible and smart. And full employment would be a game changer because then workers would not be in the precariat. They would not be living in fear. Wage pressure in the capitalist system, 5% unemployment, is a way to scare people into taking crap jobs for not enough money. It's a pressure point on working people. If those working people could go to their government and get an adequacy by taking a job doing something meaningful, then private capital would have to also raise their wages up to that level, and then everybody would be at adequacy. So full employment is no joke. And modern monetary theory, which is an advance on Keynesianism, MMT, they insist that governments can make a whole lot of money, and that's questionable. I mean, I think maybe it's true, but we don't know. But they insist also on full employment. They call it the JG, the job guarantee, that the government is the employer of last resort. That too would be good to happen. Okay, the third ingredient, biosphere health. And this one, kind of simpler, kind of beautiful. You leave about half of the Earth's surface and half of the ocean to the wild animals, to our cousins, or to our horizontal brothers and sisters. E.O. Wilson called it half Earth, and now it's been stepwise made into the 30 by 30 plan. About 50 nations have signed on, including the EU and the United States. California has got a 30 by 30 plan, and I met the woman who directs it. 30% of the land kept, preserved, conserved, wild, in some not completely pure wilderness way. There will be various definitions. People will accuse it of being greenwashing, but in fact, if there's a conservation easement on it, it's going to be a good thing, even if it's slightly slack compared to pure wilderness. The animals will love it, and they need it, because 97% of the biomass on the land of this earth is humans and their domestic beasts. The wild creatures are only 3% of the biomass. We're that close to a mass extinction event. It's just as bad as the climate emergency is for us. We need to make that 30 by 30 work. Everybody kind of likes it. People are collapsing into the cities on their own recognizance. Young people are going to the cities. Cities can be kind of greened. They can be worked as a technology of life. And meanwhile, the landscape managed correctly, can make big habitat corridors. Entire continents can be crossed by animals that then can move north with the global warming or south in the southern hemisphere and live their own lives and survive this desperate moment in their history. So that is a really wonderful development, the 30 by 30 plan. And I'm so proud. E.O. Wilson, a great American intellectual, an ant biologist who turned into a major force in American intellectual history. When he published Half Earth, I thought, another utopian science fiction writer. And just like the Dalai Lama the other morning, everybody's writing science fiction. It's kind of beautiful. I didn't think it would ever happen. It's only 10 years later, and we've got active 30 by 30 plans. So I am startled by the speed with which good things are happening. And it's a sign, and it's something to hold on to, because it is going to be messy. Okay, now I'm coming to, I have a few more things to say, but not many. All these programs that I'm suggesting to you in this recipe, they're not my ideas, and that's a good thing. You wouldn't want them to be my ideas. I myself would be scared. If they were my ideas and the rest of the world didn't have them, I'd be thinking, uh-oh, there must be something wrong with it. In fact, a lot of them are old ideas, and you can name them. They're tried and true. They're even somewhat shop-worn, and you have to think, would they still work in the modern era? In politics, I'm talking about social democracy, as in Scandinavia. And maybe you can turn the dial of history, get to democratic socialism if necessary. These names aren't the important thing. It's the adequacy. It's the commons. It's government of the people, by the people, for the people. And that's what's important, not the name of social democracy or democratic socialism or whatever. I note that, was it yesterday morning that the Dalai Lama said, I love socialism? And so I wrote that down really fast. It surprised me. And Thomas Piketty, maybe the greatest political economist of our time, at least from my political angle, his latest book, well, one of the latest, is called Time for Socialism. So these are interesting endorsements of the idea that it should be people over private interests, it should be the commons over property, it should be government over business, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people should direct the economy. So there's a beautiful image out of Kate Raworth, donut economics. When I got it, I thought it was powerful because it's a graphic. You know what a donut looks like. The inner boundary is justice. You don't let anybody fall through the inner boundary into misery. The outer boundary is the planetary boundary. You can't blow up the planet without wrecking your own home and body. And so it's the government that by regulations, rules, and laws sets those boundaries, and then private enterprise can do its thing in a circular economy like someone talked about earlier today, but inside those boundaries, so that it isn't so damaging where a capitalist business would say, I don't care if I blow up the world at one edge into a planetary hothouse Earth because I've got my quarterly profit and my shareholder value. And I don't care if that worker is in misery because I've got less labor costs. Well, that should be illegal, and it could be made illegal, and we could work within those boundaries, and that's what government should be for. So the economics is just Keynesianism. Really, government stimulates when needed, and private industry does what it does with the help of government, giving a push every once in a while, doing a works project administration, paying people to work when business has crashed into a depression. That's just Keynes. And modern monetary theory is just a little push on Keynes. And Keynes worked from the New Deal, 1932, to 1980, when the Reagan-Thatcher revolution said, oh my God, we've got stagflation, let's just blow this up and go back to unrestricted market capitalism, the neoliberalism that we've been living under. So it's a proven system, and we can go back to it. It isn't a new idea. It isn't innovative or illegal. It just simply needs to be gone back to and put to use. All right. And, if people thinking, oh, but those are Keynes, they tried it, it didn't work. That's another lie out of capitalist realism, like billionaires are natural. No, it did work, and it got dismantled. Think of it that way. There's an ideological war going on at all times between the commons and enclosure. Wherever there's a commons, there is a movement to enclose it and privatize it. Public over private. The private interests will try to privatize it and go for their own individual profit. The fight for the commons. Sometimes enclosure wins so big that the immiserated people will overthrow their government and institute the American Revolution, the French Revolution. In other words, the enclosure of the 18th century was so severe on working people, on farmers and peasants, that they blew up their governments and set up a virtual commons, which was democracy. But then, enclosure of democracy, that's what we see with lobbyists buying our legislators and buying their votes and pushing it around. Always you have to fight to get the commons back against the enclosures. That will never go away as a battle. So I've talked about politics, I've talked about economics, because it's always political economy. These are just two aspects of the same thing. They are not separate, they are linked together, and you should always study political economy and not economics, because economics is just a quantitative analysis of capitalism, whereas a political economy is, let's go back to the axioms and study the system from the ground up. What are we trying for? If we're trying for that donut of human health and planetary health, which kind of economy would work, and then you legislate it, and then you make it work. So it's always political economy. But what about values? I mean, we have talked a lot about that. Why are people acting the way they are? Why are kids acting the way they are? Why are rich people acting the way they are? Values? Well, they're real. And it is a huge pleasure, because we are in Dharamsala, to say Buddhism, the value system that should be applied in this situation, is very isomorphic, which is to say it's pretty much Buddhism. It's the same. The values are things like compassion, fellow feeling, altruism, helping others as the goal of your life, mutual aid, solidarity. You see those words shade into political positions. Solidarity is kind of a political word, but it's a value. So being in the space where the Dalai Lama has lived and helped the world with his vision, and seeing him yesterday and hearing him say the things that he said, it's the perfect space to affirm that Buddhist values are they are the same as all the other good values that will get us through this crisis by people coming together. So it's going to be very messy next couple of decades. We're in a war, we're in a pandemic. It's not going to be a series of successes. The recipe that I gave you, I think it could work, but there are people who think that plan is crazy. They don't believe in it. They've got other ideas. It's going to be a political fight, a wicked political fight. Young people, but not just young people, baby boomers, as you do retire, you've got some money, you've got some time, why not go out there and pretend it's 1968 and, demonstrate again? It has to be everybody. But for sure, the young people have their lives on the line in a way that old people don't, because we're going to die, and the young people, you're going to have 50 more years of this. You're never going to get away from this. Sad but true. And so in that messiness, I'm thinking of... Well, think of history as a kind of a river, and it's at the ocean, estuary. So it's tidal, because it runs. There's times when it seems to be running well. There's times when it seems to be running backwards. So you got to walk out into the riverways and feel with your body which way it's going, and hope for the best in your time, because you can't do it yourself. But you are part of a movement. You're part of a generation. You're part of humanity. We are all indigenous to now. And so we are all in the same boat in that respect. And it's only when you're knee-deep or thigh-deep in that stream you're going to be able to see which way it's going. Because the foam on the surface is going to be blown by winds. It's going to be the internet. It's going to be people freaking out. It's going to be many people saying, we're losing, we're losing, we're losing. Oh, my God, we're doomed. And meanwhile, if that river is going the right direction and you feel it, you can ignore the foam and you can think, I'm in the right moment here and I'm joining other people to do the good work and dodge the mass extinction event, have a good Anthropocene. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Stan, for taking us through this exercise in science fiction imagination. Yeah. I have some questions, but I'd like to take a moment to check in the room if there are any immediate questions, remarks. Okay, can we have the mic, please? There's one here right in the front. Okay.
Thanks, Stanley. Utopian science fiction. In 1979, scientists found out that there was a certain gas that was building up in the atmosphere, and it was going to basically wipe out life on the planet. And they said, what do we do about it? So scientists got together, held conferences like this, and they got the world governments to act, and they solved the problem. It's not global warming, it's not carbon dioxide buildup in the atmosphere, it is CFC buildup that was killing the ozone layer. Scientists realized the problem, politicians acted, and the 1985 Montreal Protocol was signed. So there you have it. World governments can come together to avert global catastrophe. Why isn't it happening with carbon?
Well, I think there's an immediate answer. Those CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, they ran our refrigerators and some air conditioners. There was a minute quantities of them. And so, although they were minute quantities, they were incredibly poisonous to the ozone layer. And it was easy for governments to say, oh yeah, let's outlaw that stuff, find another refrigerant, and go on. But when it's carbon, your whole civilization's running on it. It's running in your veins right now. The food that you've eaten, the travel that you've taken in your life, it's all fossil fuel driven, and it's expensive and scary. And the fossil fuel industry is a big lobby that seems not to have understood. And of course, when you're getting paid lots, you are good at not understanding the need for getting carbon out of there fast. So we have both a giant problem of replacement, very expensive, and a powerful group of people with a lot of money arguing against doing the project in the first place. Nevertheless, I think they're going to get steamrolled by history because the scientists have made a pretty damn good case. It's taken a while. It's taken 25 years for them to put this right on the center of attention of civilization, saying you cannot ignore this. Let's think about risk. And I want to say that one thing that private capital has been doing that is quite wonderful is when they say risk-adjusted investment, what they mean by that is we're taking climate change into account. That's the risk adjustment. But think about risk. There's risk that is high risk or low risk. But then there's also risk of something happening that is fatal, or there's a risk of something happening that's trivial. What's weird in risk assessment and risk management is you have something that has a low probability of happening, but if it happens, you're dead. So you have to take that very seriously. And now what the scientists have proved is if this happens, civilization is wrecked, and it's a very high probability that it's going to happen, that we're on a direct course to it. So in risk assessment terms, nobody can ignore it anymore. It's no longer a complex problem of risk assessment. It's a no-brainer.
We had another question here in the front.
Hi. Hello. So I was wondering, since your book talks about a world post-climate change, post-addressing climate change and what it looks like, did you, for this, get some inspiration from the Solarpunk theme that exists, where it's talking about a world which is integrating nature and tech, and that's the kind of civilization that we can probably look forward to once we've created and tackled the base layers of climate change? I have a couple more, just finish. Second was, you talk about, gravitating towards some form of socialism. Maybe for me, the biggest silver lining with capitalism was the way it incentivizes innovation and how it keeps that ball rolling. And if we need to transition to a more socialist state, how do you ensure that this still happens? Because that is what is right now providing most of our technology, most of the comforts that we are experiencing right now, in some ways are because of that. So, I mean, how do you strike a balance where, being still able to distribute the wealth, but still being able to incentivize people to take actions and take on risk? basically, and to go forward in that direction. And third was that, I mean, we speak about neoliberalism quite a bit right now, and it is safe to say that where we are right now is a product of neoliberalism, where we have externalized negative externalities, and and that whole system doesn't incorporate any of this. Do you think it's possible that post World War II era, where we formed this idea of wealth, of GDP, of like currencies, which are now in limelight, those same currency systems can then take us into this new world that we are trying to create, because they're also really indebted to the current system. So does it mean that you need to have a ground up change rather than trying to have incremental change on top? I mean, we do understand that dollars got their deep pedigree because they were used for petro trade, and that's what's established its dominance. Now, if you're talking about a wholly different world, do we think dollars dominance can lead us into that world, or then do we need to like come up with something which is radically new, which is like you say, when carbon coin is backed by like pulling carbon out? But I mean, carbon also for me is a very small part of the picture. Like the ecological crisis is a bigger thing, and maybe we do have too much focus on carbon right now, and it's urgent to deal with it. But for the bigger picture of having things like clean air or clean water or ecosystems back the money that we tend to like agree on, do you think something like that also going forward would help us radically address the problem and not just try to come up with incremental solutions?
Well, thank you for that. I will give brief answers to each, and I think I'll start at the first one. Solarpunk is a group of young people writing utopian science fiction, but they're a little embarrassed at the antiquity and the idealism of the name utopia. And punk is such a cool name, coming from cyberpunk, steampunk. It's the name for new movements in science fiction, like Watergate, Irongate. The way it's a suffix at the end of a scandal, punk is the suffix at the end of a new science fiction literary movement. So you have solarpunk. But in fact, you don't want to. This is not the right moment to go out into the mean streets and cobble together something without paying attention to the larger system. So I think they've got it wrong. They're kind of my grandchildren in terms of they've read my work, they like it, they want to take it out into a wilder world. God bless them. I like them. I always argue with him they should just call it utopian science fiction and put their flag out in a good space, but I'm not winning that argument. So go read some Solarpunk. They are great, and they're a lot of fun. They're trying to make it not virtuous, not puritanical, not suffering, not renunciation, but stylish innovation and fun, coping with the crisis, and I love that about them. That's a hard question about how do you incentivize in a social democracy or in a socialist system supposedly the spur of ambition, that if I innovate, I'll become rich, I'll be an entrepreneur. I'll innovate, entrepreneur, incentivize. These are all neoliberal words. And they're making suppositions about human nature and human organizations that I think are historical and not trans-historical. In other words, we are almost anything. Once our culture is done with us, we can be very different. And I think that there are ambitious people in socialist systems that got fouled up by kleptocrats and bureaucracies that didn't work right, and it wasn't good governance. If this was a government that was a people's government and public over private, but if it was honest, if it had incentives, if there were still incentives for good work, the scientists and the people who would like to start up some new enterprise that might have they might get a capped wealth, but they would hit a 10 on the 1 to 10 ratio. They'd be walking around, I'm a 10, because I did this. That might be enough. But I agree that this is an experiment. And then as to money, another experiment, but money. It's storage of value, medium of exchange, and sign of social trust. Unless you trust the money, like I give you $1, you give me a cup of coffee, even though we're on the other side of the world. Why? Or I stick my plastic card onto a thing, and then you'll give me something material. Why? Because we trust money. Now, younger people and theorists, monetary theorists, are trying to teach me that cryptocurrencies, digital currencies, personal contract, smart contract currencies, not Bitcoin, which is clearly some kind of mistake, a criminal enterprise that burns too much carbon to make its value proof of work, that will go away. But digital money might not go away. That's what fiat currency uses too. So it might get really interesting in terms of trying to decentralize if you can find people that you trust to make these exchanges. So I'm trying not to be as old guard. I mean, I was never a Stalinist, but I was an old guard socialist who was like, you got to be kidding me with this cryptocurrency, this libertarian nonsense. I really do hate libertarianism. But there might be something going on there with digital currency and with decentralization. So I'm not sure.
Thank you for that. We have three. We have one here at the back, and then we'll get to Martin, and then to you at the back. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Go this way. And sorry, can I just suggest that we take all the three questions first, and then Stan can decide in which order he'd like to answer them. Yeah.
Mine's a comment more than a question, so take the questions.
Okay, great, thanks.
Hi, thank you for the wonderful speech. My question is about language. How do you think different languages influence the way we reimagine future? And how do you think that climate crisis changes the thought process in thinking about solutions in different languages? So it's reverse in some way. Thank you.
Yeah, the back there.
Hello. Hi. Speaking of socialists or socialist claiming states and green technology, neoliberalism, can you hear?
Yeah.
Speaking of China, China is trying to become the face of now the green technology and innovation in green technology. But at the same time, it's justifying colonial occupation and imperial aggressions everywhere else. So how do you justify green technology alongside colonial occupation and imperial aggressions everywhere else in the interest of economic development? And I mean, to me, like this is, we've been talking, you've talked about neoliberalism here. I mean, to me, this is like neoliberal language as far as green technology innovation is concerned. And then, you know, they claim to be socialist, a socialist state. So, like, how do you imagine, like, to me, this feels like a new move for governments to say, on the one hand, they're, you know, tackling climate crisis, while at the same time doing the same old things, just using new language.
I just say mine's a comment.
Okay.
Yeah, let me go backwards because I'm thinking about what you said, and I appreciated the questions that you had earlier where people were talking about, oh, people have to have a change of consciousness, and you insisted, no, we have to have a change of laws. And I agree with you on that. As for green technology, humans are technological creatures. So, and we are in a world of 8 billion people on a planet that might support, I don't know how many, if it wasn't the technology that we've already built. So we're out at the end of a pyramid of prostheses that was built accidentally, and we're up there, and we can't just crash it because billions will die. So I have no problem whatsoever with technology. It depends on who it's for, who's paying for it, who's deciding which to employ. And if it's green technology in a real sense, in other words, solar panels versus burning coal, I don't think there's any problem with that. There will be greenwashing. There will be people saying, hey, my coal is the greenest technology around. And you just have to laugh at them or shame them or ignore them and go on. So neoliberalism is still kind of in charge, and getting past it into whatever comes next. I sometimes say what comes next is anti-austerity, turn the dial, Keynesianism, turn the dial, modern monetary theory, or social democracy, turn the dial again, see where you are, and see where you go next without defining it. So this is my prescription for dealing with this neoliberal moment. And admittedly, it's vague and gestural, and again, a utopian vision, but that's how I think of it. As for language, thank God the Tibetan people are so coherent and inspired and inspirational to hold on to the Tibetan language. And I don't know how many million there are of Tibetan language speakers, but you gotta, I mean, this is an obvious thing and you know it better than I, but you gotta hold on to that language and the culture that goes with it with all your might and hang in there for the long haul. It might be a longer haul than you used to think, but you know, history never ends. And over the long haul of history, you'll be back up home someday, but you've got to have your language and your culture with you when you get there. So, and for sure, the Chinese are trying to wipe it out. And so I have a certain amount of regard for China. I don't necessarily think that China is simply a monster. Not at all. And I believe them. When they say socialism with Chinese characteristics, well, it's a name for a kind of state capitalism. It's a weird name. So language does matter in multiple ways. What do you call it? What do you try for? And China, dang, they're unstable. They are obviously big, but they've got 300 million internal illegal immigrants from them because they don't have hukou. They're living illegally. 300 million people are in China as refugees of their own nation. Well, that can't last forever. This is exploitation. This is as bad as 19th century capitalist exploitation of your working class. They have a working class that they're treating like crap. And you have to skip home to your village if you get sick and hope that the village system will work after you've been away so long. So you can kind of, if you hang on, China, if the Communist Party does not trust the Chinese people are going to just knock them aside someday, like they've done 3 or 4 times in the past to their rulers. The Chinese people have no problem with just taking their leadership and tossing them over a cliff or into the ocean and making up a new system. It's happened before 3 or 4 times, 5 or 6 times. Could happen again, and you'll be ready at that point.
Martin, we have a question. Comment here, sorry.
Yeah, it's a comment. Thank you. I read your book. It took me forever, but there we go. So it was really nice. It was nice. Well, it took me quite a while. It was nice to have you kind of, in a sense, speak in your own words, rather than speaking through characters. So that was good. And you're a science fiction writer, and I get that. I think in a sense, in a comment, and I'm sorry if this is a little lengthy, but as a comment, I'd like to knit it up with quite a lot of the comments that have been made here, particularly about histories of colonialism. All right, now there's a strong sense that many people have, whenever talking about climate change issues, indigeneity, all of these things, that the history of colonialism is something we cannot untangle from this puzzle. And I'd kind of like to knit those two together by not doing science fiction, but doing a bit of history. Because your comments focus around, for what is for you the puzzle of ownership. Okay, and you have this discussion about the nature of an enclosure and the commons. And I think that's vital. I have to say, I think that's vital. If you look at the history of the development of colonialism now, and the development of land ownership, and the development of technology, and altogether the growing increase in CO2 levels across the world, all of that, roughly speaking, starts around 1750. Now, I'm from Scotland, as everybody knows, and in Scotland, 1750 is a bad year because the Enclosure Acts transformed the Scottish Highlands, all right? Basically, for those of you who don't know what that is, that was the point at which the Parliament in England, after the Act of Union, said a feudal landowner can own the land that he has completely, and he doesn't have to observe any of the contracts and established traditional land rights that people have to wood, to water on those lands. He can just empty them out. And in Scotland, of course, that led to the Highland clearances, which drove many Scots to the ports and across to the New World, where they said, we fancy a bit of that too. So they started enclosing land. And they started pushing people off that were there, okay, using the same principle of enclosure. Now, enclosure is important historically in this regard, because the minute you've got all of your people off your land, if you want to grow wheat on it, you have to mechanize. all right? That's the point where you start getting CO2 increases, and you get the industrial revolution starts really kind of kicking forward. So I would sort of say, in a sense, I'm agreeing with your argument in a larger sense, but I think it could be knotted together with this question about colonialism in a deep way, because rather than looking forward and rather than looking just back to the point at which Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher decided they fancied one another, instead we need to look a lot further back than that, to the 1750s, to really look at this. And I think this question of, rather than necessarily the question of technology itself, the ideas about ownership that drove that technology is really one of the questions we need to look to the heart of. And the reason for that, to a certain extent, and the inclusion problem, is not because, I mean, I like the idea of the 50% Earth. But let me be blunt about this, because I wrote that report, and what that report on Asia says is climate change is going to give us 50% only. Because so much of the land that we now can use, we are not going to be able to use. I'm afraid to say the animals may not be able to use it either, but processes of desertification, salination from the coasts, water level rise, we're going to end up with 50%, and we're going to have to probably really reconsider enclosure all over again, and we're going to be forced to. It ain't going to be a choice. Thank you.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, history never stops, and you can run this back. I recommend to you David Graeber's latest book, The Dawn of Everything, where he shows that our sense of the agricultural revolution and the beginnings of the first cities, some of them on the Indus River, that these are just so stories, and that the actual archaeological evidence shows that it was much messier and more variable than our standard stories, which kind of lead to stories of human nature. Like the moment there's a surplus, a ruling class will come in and kick your ass. Well, apparently that's not actually true in archaeological time. That there were centuries, thousands of years, where people were living close together in somewhat egalitarian circumstances. Now, I regard archaeology as another kind of science fiction looking backwards. You look at 3 rocks, an arrowhead, and a piece of shard, and you're going, oh yeah, they had equality there. And it was a matriarchy, in fact. I'm thinking, okay, but I would shudder to do that as a science fiction writer, to be that speculative out of such little evidence. So it's a very fun game. I love archaeology. And boy, this must be a great subcontinent for archaeology, my lord. Question?
We have a question from the online space, if we could just take that quickly.
Yeah.
So someone's asking, they're curious to ask you about your connection with Buddhism, because they have been reading your books, they're a fan, and they've noticed that you have a habit to insert Buddhist references and storylines in your novels.
Did you send that question around to come back to you?
No, it's actually a question that's come in, guys. I wouldn't be that sneaky. But it's come through, and they've actually followed it up with a question. They're curious as to what question did you ask His Holiness?
Oh, yes, thank you.
And how did that go? Yeah, so if you could take that, and then we'll come back. I know that there are a couple of hands here as well.
I'll be as quick as I can for something that I love so much. I am a Californian. I came to college in 1970. The Vietnam War was raging, and I was just like every other kid. I had long hair and a beard. I smoked a lot of pot. I took some acid, and of course I read Ram Dass and Timothy Leary and Gary Snyder and D.T. Suzuki. And I went to the Sierras, and the Sierra Nevada of California blew my mind, and I've never come down from that trip. I've been at 12,000 feet ever since 1970 in my soul. And there is California hippie New Age Buddhism. It's a sect. What?
A Dharma bum.
A Dharma bum, yes. And in fact, Allen Ginsberg came out to California with Jack Kerouac, and they hung out with Gary Snyder, who is my guru and my friend. I visit him often. He's 92. He's like the Dalai Lama in so many ways. And they visited the Dalai Lama here in 1962 when they were on passage to India. So a Dharma bum. Now, what kind of sect of Buddhism is this? Well, it's pretty slack. It's whatever you want. It's Zen, but actually there's 2 things going on in California Buddhism. One tries to be more Buddhist than the Buddhists back in Asia to show that they're the real deal. They're really strict. They do their chants like robots. They torture their trees and they expel them. You go to Glen Gulch Monastery like I did once, and it's just like, you got to be kidding me. This is not my sect. The other sect is Gary Snyder. Oh, I sat on my butt for 10 years in Japan. What a waste of a decade. But, you know, I'm a pretty relaxed guy. And he is. He's joking, like the Dalai Lama jokes. He did not waste that 10 years of meditation. He is a great soul. And I've written about Buddhism often. I would say The Years of Rice and Salt is a Buddhist novel and a reincarnation novel. I would recommend that to you as one of my favorite of my own books. All the Europeans die in the Black Death. And then it's China, India, Dar al-Islam, and Native Americans. And world history continues for 700 years. How do you tell 700 years in a novel? Reincarnation. I have these three people that come back and they always keep running into each other. And you can tell because their names always begin with the same letter. So it's not that hard to figure out who's who. And then I wrote a book about a small Tibetan Buddhist colony like the ones that are down south that was in the Sundarbans. It's a Kambalang, it's a Bayul. It's one of your colonies that isn't here. And it gets flooded by sea level rise and goes to Washington, D.C., thinking that it will change Washington, D.C. and the world by influencing the National Science Foundation. This is a novel called Green Earth. I also wrote a very silly set of stories called Escape from Kathmandu. I don't know if I would look at that one. Since I was a hippie trekker in 1985, God knows what I wrote, but I had a good time, and so did my wife. Excuse me if there are all kinds of Western othering and Orientalisms and all of the stupid stuff that an ignorant young white guy might write. But we did love it, and it was an influence on my life. So when I got the invitation to come here, it was an instant yes, and I was just so happy, because it's been a big part of my life all along. Oh, and daily life. Okay, this is one thing about Zen that I like. Daily life. I'm washing the dishes. The rest of my housemates are such slobs. I'm washing dishes. I'm irritated. And then I think, wow, this dish is getting really clean. It was all dirty, and now it's clean. And this is kind of a devotional practice. This is chop wood, carry water. And I begin to feel good. Or I go down with a friend of mine, and we run in a park, and we chase a Frisbee, we pick it up, we throw it again. We're exactly like dogs. You know, dogs chasing a Frisbee in a park. We do that for an hour. We call it running meditation. It is a Zen exercise. And same with my gardening. I pull up the weeds. I have this purple nutsedge. I'm pulling it up. I'm going, sorry about this. You're going to be really good compost. And 30-year battle with nutsedge, which I've lost. But it's been a Buddhist meditation in the Zen variety. And, you know, Tibetan Buddhism is so much more spectacular, so much more ornate than Zen, so much older. And it has an exoticism for the Western student that is attractive, but also hard to incorporate into one's life compared to the California Zen that I'm in, that I live. I live in a mindset where, thank God, I just brought up Christian. I can't tell you what a revulsion I feel against the big three monotheisms. And when the Dalai Lama was, yesterday morning, he's going, it's not a religion, it's a way. And he's making that clarity about Buddhism as being a way that's tolerant. And I didn't mention tolerance. Like, I think the Buddha would say, oh, your Buddhism is quite good, you know. I think the Dalai Lama, if I was to describe it, he would say, oh, Buddhism is just as good as any other. That tolerance doesn't exist in the rest of the world, and we really need it. So there is something quite beautiful about the Buddhist way. And thank you. That's all I can say.
Sorry, there's a question here, and then we'll go back there. And I think, yeah, maybe one more after the two, and then we'll wrap up. Yeah.
Stanley, great talk. Okay, great talk. Thank you. My question kind of follows from what you were talking about. Am I right that this is your first time to India?
Yes.
And the first time to meet His Holiness?
Oh, I saw him in Washington, D.C. I flew to the basketball arena in Washington, D.C., where he was speaking to 13,000 people about 10,000 of them East Asians that had come to DC to see him. This was in 2006. It was beautiful. It was a great couple hours. Just great.
But you've been writing about India, and you've been writing about Tibetans. How is it now to see India in real life? How is it now to meet Tibetans in real life? How is it now, and what was your question to His Holiness?
Oh, yeah. Well, I must say, I am overwhelmed. It's beautiful. It's all of the Tibetans that I've met here, I couldn't, I've met a few Tibetans in the United States, but to see it as a culture, a living culture, the dance that we went down and saw last night, I couldn't be more impressed. And, you know, given the lifetime that I just described to you, it's like a pilgrimage to a holy place, which it is. So it's been overwhelming. I did spend quite a bit of time in Kathmandu and up in the Solarpunk. So when I imagined my Indian chapters of the subsequent novels, I would kind of think about the Terai. I spent some time in a little village that was very close to the border. It was just like, as far as I could tell, it was just like an Indian village. So there's some familiarity here. If you took Kathmandu and you threw it against a vertical hillside, you know, it wouldn't be hugely dissimilar to this place, at least in my memory from 1985. So, and you know, my most famous novel is set on Mars. So my ability to imagine other peoples and cultures. Oh, I forgot one fun thing. In the Mars trilogy, the Martians have folk tales, and so there's Paul Bunyan who goes to Mars. So that's the American folk tale of the giant. But there's also the little red people. So the little red people are smaller than grains of sand, and the humans don't really notice they're there. But they are Buddhists, these little red people. And when the Dalai Lama passes on to his next existence, he reincarnates as all the little red people on Mars. So this is the kind of game that I was playing with my love for this tradition. And what I asked the Dalai Lama, he said, well, you look for Mars, you see this beautiful blue planet, and it could turn into a white planet, lose all its water within a few centuries. And I'm thinking, dang, that's a science fiction story. The Dalai Lama is a science fiction writer. He's telling a story about the view from Mars. I do that all the time. You know, from Mars, you would see a double star, one blue, one white. And that would be the Earth and the Moon. And sometimes Venus would be right next to it. So you'd have white, blue, white. I mean, this is the kind of thing I imagine all the time. So I got up and I asked him, you know, welcome to the Club of Science Fiction Writers, Your Holiness. It's a good crowd. I'm glad you're part of it. And he's like, who is this guy? But then I asked my real question, which is, how can Buddhism help scientists to do better science? Because that's what my novel Green Earth is all about. Put Buddhism and science together in a Petri dish. Do you get something more powerful? And I think maybe so. And I wondered. And he immediately latched onto his long studies with scientists to do the science of mind, where he's an adept, where he knows things the scientists don't know from his tradition, from his practice. So he's had a very productive collaboration as a guy interested in science who's also helping with experiments. And so he remembered and talked about some of that work when I asked my question. It's pretty glorious.
Yeah, we have one more.
So I wanted to comment on the solar power, green technology stuff. In Ngari right now, which is the western part of Tibet, the Chinese have built solar farms. And before building them, they kicked out a bunch of Tibetans to build them. They sell a shit ton of that solar power energy to Taiwan and et cetera. I just wanted to kind of emphasize how we've been talking about how certain ways of thinking about the world is, as far as, you know, how we think about the mountains and the land, are being, you know, bulldozed under the claim of modern development. And I think the same thing is being done with green technology right now. I don't think there can be any excuses as far as calling it green, as far as neoliberal language washing is concerned. And at the same time, when we think about European industrialization, it came with empire building. All of that was in tandem. You know, like we talk about global capitalism right now, all of that coincides with empire building. So we cannot excuse empire building, even if they want to call itself, the innovator of green technology, it doesn't, erase the fact that it's still being done under the impetus of empire building, which also happens with colonial occupation. So I think we do need to be extremely careful. We're talking about language here, how green technology and climate crisis can become language for justifying imperial occupations and development. So I do think that we need to be clear about that.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. But look, if the Chinese had kicked out those Tibetans and built 5 coal plants, which they have done, that would have been worse than putting those solar panels there. And earlier, the panel discussion previous to this said something like there's no such thing as a green technology. I think what they meant is there's costs and benefits, there's trade-offs. And right now, we need to stop burning carbon into the atmosphere, or else we'll have a mass extinction event, and society will collapse, and billions will die. So I don't care about that other stuff. I don't care about the past. I don't care about the history of imperialism at this point. The Chinese are imperialists for sure into Tibet, but if they start making solar panels cheaper than anyone else, sell them to everybody else, put them in the ground, you only have to cover like 1/10,000th of the surface of Tibet, and you've got more power than you need for a huge part of. It's amazing how powerful solar panels have become.
Are you justifying colonial occupation as of now?
No, no. Does it sound like I am?
For green technology.
No.
The next,
No.
Development, where's the line?
The line is a healthy biosphere with everybody living at adequacy.
Homogeneous ways of talking about global problems that are specifically locally rooted. We're talking about it in such homogeneous ways when it's really about governance and ways that governments think about economic development here.
Governments are the people's company. If you believe in political representation, the governments are just us. Now, they can get bought by private interests, and they often have, but anti-government feeling when governments are really of the people, by the people, and for the people is inappropriate. It's private interests grabbing governments. And so I would say that you're giving up, that you're using language and the specificities, which are real. Of course, each specific example has its past, has its present, has its future. There's no doubt about that. I'm not really disagreeing with anything that you're saying. There's ugly stuff going on in order to make money for private interests. Still happening, for sure. And it rests on earlier things that were happening. Paris Agreement says equity, that the developed nations are promised to help the developing nations with extra help to bring everybody to par with clean energy. Because energy is a human right. If refrigeration keeps your food from going bad, it's a health necessity to have electricity in this modern world with 8 billion people. It'd be best if it was justice. And that's why I started with it. I feel like you're obscuring the, probably I was speaking very fast and going through a lot of points, but I really think I'm trying to deal with this stuff as a, how can I say it? A progressive, a leftist, government over private industry. Government as being us, which means we got to grab it. Government is a site of contestation between us and private interests, between people power and the capitalists. It's a site of contestation. If we can seize government, we can have the euthanasia of the rentier class, and we can make that 1 to 10 ratio between adequacy and maximum wealth. It's a utopian vision, but it's also a political project. So there are, of course, an infinity of nasty details in this story because it's a wicked political battle, and we're in it, and in many ways, we're losing it. And, with 10 years left, before we have crossed the 2-degree sea line and the mass extinction event and the release of methane into the atmosphere, the uncontrollable stuff that we cannot claw back from, no matter if we put all civilization to it, we would have lost control. There'd be no glaciers at all. There'd be no ice on this planet. So we're in a crisis, and I'm not sympathetic to holding on to grudges from the past or focusing in on the bad details of the present as if that's the whole story.
It's ongoing right now.
I think this is,
it's not the past.
If I may,
No, it is. It's ongoing right now. I agree with you. It's a wicked political battle between neoliberal capitalists and people power. Absolutely. I think we're on the same page here. I just had to take the big picture to do world history in 30 minutes.
I'd just like to also maybe acknowledge that there is a certain privilege of not having been occupied, not having faced colonization. As a brown woman in this room sitting on this panel, from a heritage and a legacy of colonial trauma, this is something very real. This is something that is not a detail. It's something that we live with. Yeah. It's something that we're trying to unpack and decolonize in the narratives that we're building. And this is something that I don't think is up for discussion. I don't think this is something that is negotiable. I think this is something that just, in a way, is what was referenced in the previous panel. We always say, how do we make space for indigenous narratives to take space? Mm-hmm. How do we make space for indigenous meaning-making and language-making to be included into the larger climate conversation? And it was very interesting when Kaniela reversed the question to say, how do we actually sit back and listen? And how do we actually sit back and pass the mic and actually allow these narratives to take center stage and to show us something that's sometimes uncomfortable, that sometimes questions and creates discomfort. And yeah, as the moderator, I'd like us to sort of hold on to this thought and maybe carry on in with the next question. I see that there's another question here.
And my apologies. Jet has reminded me of the inappropriateness of arguing in Dharamsala of people who know the place. And besides which, your earlier question yesterday was one I thought was absolutely on point and agreed with thoroughly. And I still think I'm agreeing with you. It's just that the fight is worldwide, but my apologies.
You were mentioning the equity bit in the Paris agreements and how developed nations decided that, I think the culmination was this green climate fund that they opened up, and there was commitment for $100 billion annually to go towards projects. And I think it's been 5-6 years, they've been able to do $30-40 billion dispersal. And it's also, that is one. And the second is, we get reviews of how countries are playing by their commitments every year. And it's not on?
It's on.
Yeah.
We have one more question.
Just to say that, like right now, maybe only 3 countries are doing what they were supposed to do. The belief in government needs to be there if things need to move forward. But we are seeing very clear lack of coordination on a global scale, in terms of giving this priority.
Yes.
So do you think maybe at some point in time, even a layer above the nation states would probably come into play, which is just focused on this, because it's clearly in terms of national priorities, this does take backstage, but globally it's a big problem that everyone agrees on. Yeah. So to drive action towards it in some constructive way.
Yeah, no, it's a good point that you bring up, and it's really frightening. The tight-fistedness of the developed nations in not living up to their promises in the Green Climate Fund was driving people crazy in Glasgow. I had a red pass and was able to go into negotiating sessions and watched. And the delegates from the developing nations were getting more frustrated, more angry. They were polite, they were articulate, but how tight-fisted, short-sighted, and ugly is the behavior of the developed nations. Some of this $20 billion they've given is just debt relief. The $20 billion is less than New York City's waste budget per year for the whole developing world. So it's bullshit. It's horrible. The COP process itself might blow up because the consensus model where everybody has to agree and people are making promises and breaking their promises. This would be a disaster because COP is a place to talk. But in the next few COPs, as the 2020s go on, and the developed nations continue to break promises and we continue to burn carbon, and we know we shouldn't, that's where we're going to get violence, disruption, civil disobedience. It's going to get super intense, I believe, because I can't believe the short-sightedness of the... And don't... It's not the delegates at COP. They are like messengers. They're like your computer, and it's the governments back home that are making these decisions. Well, these are not exactly elected officials. These are bureaucrats in the administration. They're making terrible decisions. They're breaking promises. It might wreck things. There were people, diplomats at Copper, they're out of their mind with frustrations. And that is one thing that made me think that a global carbon reward, a carbon coin made up by all the central banks, that it's new money. So you're not giving away your money. You're saying, there's new money came out of nowhere, and you can have it because we promised it to you. There's horrible echoes of neocolonialism there, but on the other hand, since everybody seems to be so tight-fisted with their own money, if there was a source of money that could be used to decarbonize quickly, then that would be what you were suggesting, the Paris Agreement being fulfilled by a kind of transnational consortium of central banks. We'll see if it happens.
Thanks. One last. Okay, if we can keep it very brief, then we'll take the both, and then I want to save some time for just closing. Okay.
I got no experience with science fiction, and no experience. I think it's on. Yeah.
Yes,
So,
it is. Thank you.
No experience with science fiction, and it shows that it raises a lot of questions. It's good. It raises the blood pressure as well. And I mean, at the beginning, when based on my 30 years life story, I wanted to complain with respect to democratic socialism, but then I realized this is a science fiction. So then I kept calm, and I realized not to raise it. But many very interesting suggestions for reforms. For me, not as science fiction. Many of them I can imagine, especially in the field of internalization of the externalities, and working with carbon tax. It could be any other, political. Whatever creates externalities can be, taxed, could be given a price. And I can imagine that this works globally. But what I was a bit of surprised, if you can elaborate a bit your opinion on globalization. You haven't talked about globalization. And some of your suggestions looks like that they would in fact promote globalization and not the other way around. So if you can just tell us something about, like talking about religion as an example.
Yeah.
And just a very brief comment to you, because one positive thing you probably follow that with respect to, I mean, the world is in a stage one of a tremendous energy transformation, and it's a short time. It's a big risk which you described there.
Yeah.
And with respect to photovoltaics, the U.S. government put a ban on 4 Chinese companies who produce this polysilicon ingots in Xinjiang with the work of Uyghurs and Muslims. So it has to be controlled, and I think the answer to that is again in decentralization. That means that Europe will build its own renewable industry again, and other countries as well, not be dependent on China. I mean, how can we do that massive transformation of the whole world being dependent of one totalitarian country?
Yeah. No.
Sorry for question and comment.
Yeah, that's okay.
Remind me of the question.
Sorry. Globalization.
Oh, yes. Thank you. There's something weird going on. Globalization was the neoliberal success of finance over the state. The states were bought. They were merely passing laws, bought legislatures for trade that wrecked the environment and wrecked people's lives. And democracies signed off on it. Authoritarian countries signed off on it. And globalization in the late 90s was looking like the final triumph of capitalism over everything else. Well, that kind of, that is still in play, that dynamic. But there's another kind of globalization, which is everybody realizes they're on one planet, in one atmosphere, in one disease zone. So one planet as opposed to globalization, that we're on one planet. And we're in very differential situations, different cultures, different people on this one planet, but we know it's one planet. So I might not have even mentioned this point that well, I did. When you agree to take a payment from the international community and you have signed a contract and have given up some sovereignty to get the money, you've gone from being a nation state to a member state. And this is an important emotional and legal shift that is kind of a globalization, but not in the same old form of exploitation and, you do a cash crop, we'll take the value of it, and you will then be immiserated. That was the globalization of the 1990s. In this case, it's more like we're all in a legal agreement to give up a little sovereignty in order to make sure that we decarbonize together and with equity. So it shouldn't be the same word. There are two different processes, but they happen to both be planetary. In a nation-state system, you got to move to being a member state. And you also have to disable finance. The market cannot be the king of this world. It has to be people. So there's two different things going on under that same rubric.
Gunther, did you want to ask your question?
No, I just wondered, how do you think could this be regulated? This kind of trade-off. Who would be the arbiter to say, well, we give you this so that you keep your carbon in the ground?
Well,
that's one. And then I was thinking, well, I also see some very absurd consequences of this. Like we would have to pay Putin for not sending us gas and coal, but we will still be paying him.
It is a really big elephant in the room because I think some of the petrostates are going to have to be bailed out, or else we have a civilization crash. Some of them don't deserve it. It's like paying off criminals. Others, a country like Norway has built up a huge bank of money. Maybe they could be asked to help then the virtuous get penalized and have to pay, and the ones that have been terrible at governance and kleptocrats all along, suddenly they're getting bailed out. But we may not have a whole lot of choices here. This is a kind of a climatological realism, that we have to not burn the carbon that's in the ground. Whatever we need to do there. And sometimes this leads me to World War II. In World War II, governments just took over their economies. The people agreed to an authoritarian government that for the period of the emergency, the government told you what to do and you did it. And give us all your tin, or we'll give you 10 gallons of gas a month, or make a victory garden. Also, to finance. The British Treasury goes to the Bank of England and says, you're not the Bank of England anymore. You are a wing of the British Treasury. So the government taking over the market in order to get through a crisis is something that we've done in wars. Now, will the climate emergency strike enough people to be equivalently dangerous or not? There's a lot of difference between a bomb on your head and a bad storm the next state over.
We've done it also in the pandemic. Businesses had to close down for 2 months. The government just said, you all stay at home and you close your business.
There you go.
And we might help you if you're in trouble, but we have to stop the propagation of the virus. You all stay at home, and the shops are closed, and you're nobody on the street. So
people were
government
scared for their
in an
lives.
Emergency,
but when you're
has
scared
just
for
done
your
it.
life, you realize you're a member of a society, and that you need to be a social animal, and the society has to function, or you'll die. So that fear, climate. I think the moment might come, as I wrote in Ministry for the Future, someday none of the taps, water doesn't come out. There's, how many people in this town? 10,000? 10,000 people, no water coming out of the taps, no water anywhere around. It almost happened to Cape Town, South Africa.
Where was that town meant to be? Sorry, I've got to ask.
Well, I was working off of Cape Town, but I decided not to identify it. It almost happened to Cape Town, South Africa. They ran out of water. Well, what do those citizens do at that point? They have to trust their society. They can't make it alone. They're a bee in a beehive, and that beehive better function or else all the bees die. That's when the emergency will get us to act in concert. And we don't want to get that close. So what I've been working on is this idea. If I present a story to you, and you read the story, it's like someone said to me at Glasgow, you do not have to be in a plane crash to know that you don't want to be in a plane crash. So once you've got the story in your mind, once you've got examples around the world, and you've had some outrageous earthquakes here, so catastrophe can strike, And then you're a social animal. You're like a bee in the beehive, and the beehive has to function, so then you have to be part of a group. And at that point, the small differences aren't going to matter as much, because you're going to have to come together. That's the mutual aid, that's the solidarity.
I'm going to call upon my moderator authority to bring this conversation to a close. Thank you, everyone, for all of your comments, questions, for visibilizing a lot of the elephants in the room. Yeah, thank you. There are many more that continue to exist. And yeah, I wanted to intentionally begin by recognizing and acknowledging all of the people for whom it's already begun. They've begun to lose their homes. They've begun to lose their lands. Or they're living through occupation, which makes it even harder to have a say as to what happens to your resources. And it's easy for us to imagine sitting in Dharamsala, but there are people who are already in this future that we're imagining right now. So for them, it's their reality. But having said that, one of the beautiful things about this dialogue, if we look for the, silver lining in this messy cloud of people from different perspectives and different backgrounds and different understandings and ideological beliefs, is that, as His Holiness pointed out to us and has been saying since the very beginning, is that it will need all of us. And it will need all of us to, as Bell Hooks says, to invite hope to stay and ask fear to leave. I may have changed that a little bit, but that's more or less what she says. I know that for a lot of young people, and I know this is true for myself as well, climate anxiety, eco-anxiety is a real thing. It's not just something that's made up. It's something that some days you wake up and you cannot imagine what you are expected to do with, the time clock running out and looming over your head. And I wanted to take this time to really sort of invite us into holding on to a certain kind of hope. And I'm not going to say it with my own words. I'm going to borrow the words of a Black American feminist by the name of Mickey Scott Bay Jones, who has a short poem, if you'd allow me to read it out. And I invite all of you to sort of lean into the words of this poem as an invitation to how we could all potentially build solidarity, hold each other accountable, be these imperfect allies for one another, and try and have a fighting chance to get out of this devastating situation. So it's called An Invitation to a Brave Space. Together we will create brave space, because there is no such thing as a safe space. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars, and we have all caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together, and we will work on it side by side. So yeah, I'd just like us to hold on to this as we go back into the worlds that we've come from, and sort of continue to build solidarity and remember to not leave anyone behind because it's inconvenient or uncomfortable, but to really try to continuously be progressively progressive. Yeah. On this note, I'd like to invite Dechen Pamula, who is the researcher with Tibet Policy Institute, to offer a few words.
So I want to thank Stanley and Josna for a wonderful and very thought-provoking talk. So here are, thank you. Yes, in morning. Oh, thank you. So, my name is Dechen Palmo, and I'm from Tibet Policy Institute. TBI is one of the co-organizers of this conference, and it is my great honor to close this dialogue for our future, a call to climate action. So I want to take a few minutes to thank you for joining us here in Dharamsala and online. It is a great 2.5 days of engaging, informative, and enlightening conversation. As you have heard, environmental issues are critically important to us, Tibetans, where our home is warming at an unprecedented rate. And as the local organizing partner for the Dialogue for Our Future, TBI is thrilled to have brought so many wonderful speakers to our home in exile to discuss how climate change is impacting the roof of the world. But climate change is a global problem, and as His Holiness the Dalai Lama had told us yesterday, the only way to solve this problem is together as a global community. Meeting His Holiness the Dalai Lama turned out to be an emotional event. Miraculously, the theme of this conference was anticipated by him. Water was a major theme, as was individual responsibility and the relationship between community and leadership. He even took us on a journey through the time and gave us a glimpse of the future and a view of the planet from space. And from the 4 panels, we have learned that systematic problems require systematic solutions, but that also means that recognizing the diversity of problems and solutions, small and large, local and global. For me, this also includes a new collective narrative, even a planetary narrative, which includes more than the success story of a single technology, that of a company or that of a country. This narrative must not be left to a few elite universities. We must listen to the people. Let's show some respect for the treasure of their knowledge. As Tibetan, we are among those suffering at the hands of others, political, social, religious, and yes, environmental injustice. What brings us hope is that so many people around the world are waking up to the environmental injustice of climate change. We stand here in solidarity with everyone taking action to solve the climate change challenge. I would like to thank a few people and organizations who have made this conference possible. Those who are not here, the Office of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and Sikyong Pemba Siring, Central Tibetan Administration. And now, to those who are here, pulling off an event like this requires the dedication of so many people working behind the scene to feed us and to record us and to organize our days. So I would like to invite Krista to come up stage to offer katas. So first of all, I would like to call Wang Chula and his team from Tibet TV. I'll hold. So everyone coming? And next, Songla from Tibet Audio. Next, Guntherla from Euroc Research. And Greg Bruno from ICT, Europe.
Greg, leave the control room. He's coming.
He's coming already.
Yay.
Wang Bo Tong La.
Thank you. And I have to thank Krista. Krista, come here. She's the coordinator of this event, and she did a great job with the great team. Thank you very much.
And Martin Busek from Czech Tibet Support. And my colleague from Tibet Policy Institute, Tunu Bamula. She's not here. Okay, so she might be. Okay. And yeah, moderate, and all the wonderful speakers, both online and here. And I would like to call our moderators, Kunda Dikshila. Kunda Dikshidias. And Lofsay Ansula. And to our Krista. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, yeah, that's it. So thank you again to everyone who tuned in on to Dialogue for Our Future. Now take what you have learned and act now. We have no time to lose. Thank you.
And the last kata, of course.